thank the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce for doing this for us. They do it every year. I think it's been about 10 years now since we've been doing it. So hey, thank you guys. We appreciate you. So I want to welcome both our presenters. First of all, Paul Padilla. Paul is the Director of Market Intelligence at the Arizona Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. He's also a Phoenix, you're native, right? It's like me. And you've been with the Chamber for how long?
Total, like 30 years.
Awesome. And then also I want to introduce Monica Villalobos, who I've known for a long, long time. Actually, she was one of my first bosses in the advertising agency world back when. I won't tell you the years because I don't want you to date us. But she's been the president and CEO of the Chamber for about 3 years now, correct?
Yeah, almost 5.
Almost 5. Oh, my goodness.
Pandemic doesn't count.
Oh, yeah.
Years just count.
Also, she serves as the executive director for the Minority Business Development Agency, Business Center, the Native American Business and Economic Development Center, and Ascend Phoenix, which is funded by the J.P. Morgan Chase Foundation. So please join me in welcoming Paul and Monica.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. It is always a pleasure to talk to all of you. I see some friendly faces in the audience, so thank you for being here. Hopefully our audio is working, so I'm just going to try to not to move because I tend to move when I talk. So I'm going to try to stay right here. Today we'll be talking a little bit about datos, which just means data in Spanish. It's not a trick question. If we go to the next slide, I wanted to share with you a little bit about the work that we do. We have been around since 1948, so we're celebrating 76 years here in Arizona. We have been probably working with almost every corporate partner in town. We estimate that there are 90 Fortune 2000 companies in the state of Arizona. We have an investment relationship with about 80 of them, and you'll see their names up on the screen now. Next slide, please. And we're a little bit different than most chambers of commerce. Some of you have heard me say we're not your grandfather's chamber of commerce. And the reason that we say that is because we work in 5 specific areas where most chambers of commerce work in policy and advocacy. Our fastball is really economic development. And you heard a little bit about what we do from the federal standpoint. We have 3 federal programs that we run. The Arizona Minority Business Development Agency Center that we've had since 1997. And we also have the AIANNH grant that serves American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian communities in Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. And through our MBDA Center, we serve the whole country. So your Arizona Hispanic Chamber of Commerce really has a national footprint. We also recently were awarded the CRP Capital Readiness Program. The Biden administration set aside about $125 million, and there were about 1,800 applications for that money, and there were only 43 awards, and we were the only one in Arizona. So thank you. We're very proud of that. We are very proud of that. So as you can see, we work across different areas. All of those centers, and frankly, our entire organization is measured by 3 things: access to contracts, access to financing, and job creation. Anything that has to do with those 3 things, that's sort of how we measure ourselves. The next area is market intelligence, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. But let me cover the other ones very quickly. Capacity building, we host 50 to 60 events every year. I was talking to Kaylee on my way in, and she's attended a couple as well. Some of you may have attended. We just got through our Black and White Ball, the longest running formal gala in the state of Arizona. If you didn't attend, you should attend next year. We affectionately refer to it as the Hispanic Prom. So if you didn't go to prom in high school, you can still go to the prom every year. We also do some advocacy. Right now, we are quite embroiled in HCR 2060. For those of you who are unfamiliar with that, it is an anti-business measure to e-verify. It started with small business owners having to e-verify not only their employees, which is already the law, but also independent contractors and their subcontractors, which put a really unfair burden on small businesses to enforce immigration law. And so that passed the House yesterday. We've put out an op-ed on it. We've put out statements on it. We are working with legislators to try to get that to a more reasonable place. for Arizona, because we don't need that sort of show me your papers law that tarnished our state brand so many years ago with SB 1070. In addition to that, we focus on education. So we are a 501c6, which is the association, a 501c3, which is the foundation, and a 501c4, which is the political action committee. Education falls under our foundation. We have raised over $750,000 over the years to send students to Arizona universities. We have 3 total scholarships. One is for undergraduates studying business. The other 2 are for graduate students in either public policy or healthcare. And so we do quite a bit. We've got a small but mighty team, and it's growing very, very quickly. But today we really want to focus on market intelligence. And if we go to the next slide, I'll share with you. Next slide, sorry. There you go. I'll share with you the work that we've done in this space. We really believe that we need to own our own narrative and not have it hijacked by the media. So LATOS is the most comprehensive compilation of secondary research on Hispanic consumers. It includes national data as well as local data, and we're going to share some of that with you today. We also do primary research. So the 4 black covers on your right side is the Minority Business Enterprise Study. We did this in 2007, 2012, and 2022. This last time around in 22, we surveyed 2,000 minority-owned businesses in the state of Arizona, states of Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. So it gave us a great pre- and post-pandemic, pre- and post-recession analysis of the challenges that small businesses have. Some of the interesting findings that we found out of that study is that 51% of minority-owned businesses are family-owned, and there is a huge lack of succession planning. So if any of you are in financial services, this is a great area for you to be in. And lots of other information that we were able to glean from that study. The 6 covers in the middle are white papers on different areas that our corporate partners. Okay. That our corporate partners have really asked us to provide some guidance on. So things like, how do you leverage your employee resource group internally? How do you create a supplier diversity program? How much global trade is there from small businesses in Arizona? So all of those things are available. It is readily available to you. We believe in a free marketplace of ideas. Our commitment to you is that we will always provide you with reliable, responsible, and relevant information. And that's how we're sort of owning our own narrative. And so I think we're going to jump into some of the data maybe. Next slide. Oh, great, the wheel. So we used to do a lot of work in research. And so when you get 300 pages of charts and numbers, it can be a little overwhelming. So we partnered with Vitalist Health Foundation, which is a local gem of an organization. They help nonprofits build capacity. And what they brought to Arizona was a national best practice called the Elements of a Healthy Community. And we were able to take our data and now use this as a framework to make the data more actionable. And I'll give you an example. This year, we're focusing on affordable food. We know that 10% of Latinos in the U.S. are either food insecure or live in a food desert. Now, when we go speak to our food retail partners, the conversation is not about the latest fiesta to sponsor. It is about, here's a zip code. They need access to fresh fruits and vegetables and affordable food. That is a much more powerful conversation. And that's how we're leveraging the data. And that's how our partners are leveraging the data as well. So that's why this is so incredibly important. And now we'll jump into some of the data. Next slide, please.
All right. So time to jump into some data. So we're first going to start off at the U.S. level and then dig deeper into Arizona and then locally. So this first slide looks at the Hispanic population here in the U.S. So in the green here, you'll see non-Hispanic, and then in the red, you'll see Hispanic. So we're about at 62.5 million Hispanics here in the U.S., which is close to about 20%. So statistically, if you were to survey here, the U.S. streets would be about 1 in 5 people are Hispanic. And if we were if the U.S. Latinos, if we all gathered together, not saying this is going to happen, but if we all gathered,
We're not that organized.
start your own country, we would be, just for context, we would be the 26th largest nation in the world out of the 225 countries recognized. In Latin America itself, we would be the third largest country in Latin America, just behind Mexico and Brazil. So we've seen this population, our Hispanic population, grow by 18% as well over the past 10 years. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to jump into economic opportunity. So this looks at GDP for some of the major countries here in the world and comparing it to the output produced by U.S. Latinos. So as of the year 2020, the U.S. Latino gross domestic product was ranked fifth in the entire world at $2.7 trillion. So we're, just as a refresher, what GDP stands for, it's basically the monetary value of goods and services produced by a certain group within a certain period of time. So the period of time that we're looking at here is 2020. This is the most recent numbers. This is out of a report from UCLA. I really encourage you guys to check out this source. It's a great source. It's the Latino GDP report. Comes out every single year. These are the latest numbers. The year before that, U.S. Latinos were ranked 7th. And the year before that, they were ranked 8th. So we're going from 8 to 7 or 5, and we don't expect that to change in any way. We start to increase in our ranking. Another thing on here, we're ranked 5th here, but in the past 10 years, so from 2010 to 2020, U.S. Latino GDP was the third fastest growing GDP in the entire world. Let's go to the next slide, please. So sticking in economic opportunity, this looks at the U.S. poverty rate by major race and ethnicity groups. So what I want to highlight here is two main things. I always try to frame these at what we're doing well in as a Hispanic community, but then where's the opportunity to grow as well and get better. So I want to point out here, since 2000, Latinos in the U.S. have experienced the largest drop in poverty. So that's the thing we're doing well right now, is that we're seeing a drop. So the two bars here, one bar represents the year 2000, the second bar represents the year 2020. So in a 20-year period, the U.S. poverty rate has dropped by 6%. So we've gone from 22% to 16%. The opportunity that I want to present to you guys all, where we can improve, is that overall, if you look at that 16%, it's still pretty high compared to other major groups. Like the total U.S. population, I believe, is at 12%. Yeah, 12%. And the white population is at 9%. So, there's still some work to do. We've dropped a lot since the year 2000, but there's still opportunity to do even better. Next slide, please. All right, so this is at the Arizona level. So similar to the chart I showed initially. So this looks at the Arizona population by ethnicity. So there are about 2.4 million Hispanics here in Arizona alone, which makes up about a third of our population. So I mentioned that the U.S. Hispanic population has grown by 18% in the past decade. For Hispanics here in Arizona, that's grown about the same rate at 17%. Basically, the point we want to drive here is that, us Latinos, we drive a major impact here in Arizona, right? We're 1/3 of the population. And this is important for businesses to know. If they want to be a successful business here in Arizona, they need to know what 1/3 of their population looks like, what their desires are, what their behaviors are, and so forth. So if you want to be successful here, you can't, afford to ignore those insights. And that's why we're all here today, right? To learn those insights. So let's go to the next slide, please. And so,
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Back to me. Sorry. So Maricopa County is the third largest Hispanic county in the U.S. Between 2010 and 2020. In fact, Maricopa County was used by the census as one of the beta tests for internet census. So they want to roll that out, and Maricopa County really reflected the diversity of the U.S. And from a Hispanic standpoint, it is one of the fastest growing. You would think that it might be in California, it might be in New York, Chicago, somewhere in those general areas, but actually it is here in Arizona. We are also the fourth fastest growing city in the U.S., not counting Hispanics, just altogether. Next slide, please. So we always like to leave you with, there's still more here, but we also want you to have these numbers sort of at your ready. If you're having conversations about the Latino community, what you need to know is that there are over 62 million Hispanics in the U.S. That does not account for Puerto Rico, which is another 3.5 million, nor does it count the undocumented. So a very conservative number. Spending over $2 trillion. And you heard Paul use the number 2.7 earlier. We like to use pretty conservative numbers, so it just depends on the source. You should all know that DATOS is a 10-month process that takes 20 subject matter experts to be able to vet all of the data. All of this is readily available, you could Google it. It would take you about 5 years during regular business hours to Google all of the information that we compile. Also, we want you to remember that there are over 2 million Hispanics here in Arizona, spending over $63 billion in purchasing power. And the reason this is so important is because the myth is that Latinos are taking out of our state. That is always the argument. The fact of the matter is they're putting in far more than they're taking out. And we share that data in the book as well if you'd like to peruse it on your own. But these are just kind of fast facts for you to have handy whenever you need them. Next slide, please. Whenever you're having those research conversations over drinks, like I do. Yes, absolutely. So this is my favorite slide, especially here with marketers and at the American Marketing Association. We always think about how do we message our consumers? How do we message and advertise to our consumers? How targeted can we be? Some of you may be familiar with the Nielsen Prism segments, and there are lots of them. I think they recently narrowed them down to like 20. Does anybody know? No? It's like 20, but only, and you've seen the population numbers, only 4 of them reflect the Latino population. And so that seems a little bit off. So there are many models out there. This is the Geoscape model, and it's probably one of the most frequently used. And it's very, very simple. It's basically kind of showing you, in this case, in Phoenix, how acculturated the population is. And that means how much have they adopted and how much have they kept from their respective cultures. And so you can see it goes from HA5, which is fairly unacculturated, first generation, probably Spanish dominant, all the way up to HA1, which just stands for Hispanic American one, just super Americanized, third or fourth generation, English dominant. So there are a lot of things to keep in mind here. When you're looking at messaging to Latinos, think about things like in HA5, you're certainly going to have more multi-generational households, probably 3 generations in one household. When we talk to home builders, we're like, this is important. They're growing in influence. We know that 70% of new home ownership in the U.S. over the next 2 decades will be by Hispanics. And so you need to build the homes that they want to buy. Those are multi-generational homes. The other thing is that the language is always a big question. And especially with this group, I every year I get this question, and it's, do you advertise in English or do you advertise in Spanish? And the question is, well, that depends on what you want to do, right? Do you want to reach someone or do you want to resonate with them? Because that's the difference. We've seen bilingualism really change and increase. I'll get on my soapbox for a quick minute. Arizona remains the only state in the entire country, and I would argue the world, that has an English only in public instruction for our K through 12 students, which means that bilingualism, multilingualism, a natural resource that we have in our population here, continues to be discouraged. And that means that children are pulled out of essential classes like math and science to go to English learner classes. They are also discouraged at recess, before school, after school, or during class to ever speak their native language. As someone who spoke Spanish first when I was in school, I have found, and I think business owners have found, that bilingualism and multilingualism is a coveted skill in the workforce. This is something we need and something we want. Thank you, Eduardo. Something we need and something we want. And until our state comes to understand that, and specifically Superintendent Horn, just put him out there, learns that this is incredibly important. If we're going to be a global hub of business, we truly need to have a global mindset. On this, also keep in mind that bilingualism has changed. It's grown a lot. So before in the U.S., it used to be kind of Latinos were 30% Spanish dominant, 30% bilingual, and 30% English dominant. Now that middle piece of bilingualism has grown for a couple of reasons. One, the multi-generational households are really kicking in, so you've got more bilingualism. But there's also some growth in there due to the definition. And I always use this example. If you ask me if I am bilingual, I'll say, yes, I'm absolutely fluent. It was my first language. I can read, write, speak Spanish. If you ask my cousin who's 15 years younger than me, she will also say she's bilingual. But what that means to her is that if you speak to her in Spanish, she can answer you in English. A little bit different. I'm not quite sure that definition qualifies, but and that's how fully bilingual too. So, that's why we've seen the difference here. I also keep in mind that acculturation is fluid. This is not an A to B spectrum. It's not like, oh, I'm unacculturated and then one day I'm going to be fully acculturated. What we have found is that people go up and down the spectrum. So usually when Latinos have kids, they start to go back to their customs and traditions to be able to pass that on to their children. So they start to seek out less acculturated things and more traditional things from their heritage. And so it is, you're not ever stuck in one place. You can, depending on the situation, you can be quite fluid. And then the last thing I like to say is that, there are always, your Latino if. So if you're wondering where you might be on this chart, if you are disciplining your children with time out, you are probably pretty acculturated, closer to an HA1. If you use the Chancla method, my preferred method, you're probably closer to an HA5. Also, exactly, right? And then also HA5s, if you have an uncle that is younger than you might be Hispanic. If you have more than 3 names in your household, 3 last names in your household, you might be Hispanic. And so there are lots of little kind of nuances like that that we like to throw into acculturation. But here in Arizona, you can see how we are split between HA5 and HA1. And it's a pretty even split. This is pretty consistent with the rest of the country when we talk about Latinos as well. Next slide, please.
So we talked about multi-generational households. Now we want to talk about being multiracial. This has been a trending topic as of late. So when you see this chart immediately, you just see a big jump, right? So this looks at the number of U.S. Hispanics who identify with more than one race, so basically identified as multiracial, comparing 2010 to a decade later of around that 2021. So we see this big jump, an increase of 24 million people, Hispanics in the U.S. who identified as being multiracial and not of a singular race. It's about an 820% increase. So this is my favorite chart to talk about because we always get so many questions on, why do we see such a big increase? And at first, I really didn't know how to answer this. And it took some researching and trying to figure out what was the cost behind it. And the conclusion I've come to, not saying it's, necessarily 100% correct, but I think it makes sense. I think it's a combination of 2 main things that are going on. It's a combination of real growth that I see, and then a combination of artificial growth as well. So I want to talk about the real growth first. I think from what my research shows is that we're seeing this big jump mainly on the real side from our younger individuals here in the U.S. Individuals under 18, they're increasingly identifying more as multiracial, and they're causing this big jump. Just to provide some stats to back that up, individuals under 18 made up just 22% of the total U.S. population, But when you look at the multiracial population itself, they make up a third of that population, so 33%. So they comprise a huge portion of the multiracial population. Multiracial population is also the youngest group overall. If you compare it to Hispanics, to whites, to blacks, to Asians, they have the youngest median age at 29 and a half years old. And if you look at the multiracial group itself, you dig a little bit deeper, the most common age within that population group is 12 years old. So we're dealing with a really young group here. So that's where I see the real growth going on. But then I also think there's some artificial growth going on. So let me explain that in the next slide, please. So basically what happened is we're comparing, the previous slide showed comparisons between the 2010 census and the 2021 census. The thing is that it's hard to make comparisons as well like that because of differences in coding that happen within the census itself. So here's an example here of a person who basically identified the exact same way in the two same censuses, or in one, the 2010 census and then the 2021 census. When they were asked a question about race, when you're asked that question, you fill out check marks and say, oh, I belong to this group, oh, any of the major groups. But if there's, in addition, you want to provide more information, you can write in some answers as well. So if this person here, we see a write-in response of Cuban, Thai, and Filipino. So if that person wrote that in the 2010 census, you'll see the resulting responses that were considered were Thai and Filipino. And that's because in the 2010 census, only a maximum of 2 write-in responses were considered. And if you wrote in more than 2, there was basically a coding logic that said any kind of race-related answers were considered first before ethnicity-related answers. So the reason why Cuban was basically not considered in the 2010 version is because that's technically considered ethnicity-related. So that's not considered at all. So that person was led to just being Thai and Filipino, which are Asian-related groups. So that person was just a singular race as Asian. So they would have just been of Asian population, so considered a singular race. However, in the 2020 census, there were enhancements that were made. They realized that 2 groups was pretty restricted. So they increased it to considering a maximum of 6 groups. And there was no logic saying that ethnicity or race took precedent over ethnicity. It was read from left to right. So now that person, they kept their Thai and Filipino association, so they were still Asian, but then that person was also considered some other race for their Cuban disclosure as well. So now that person, technically that same person, anybody could have wrote this if they felt that's what they identified with. They could now go in from being a singular race to multiracial. So that's what I mean by artificial growth. That's the combination of what we're seeing that led to such a huge growth.
And another thing to consider, the census is the largest sample of research on demographics, which is why we use it, which is why there's so much weight on it. But it is not perfect, and the methodology is flawed. We've seen bias in the research, and right now they've just announced that they're going to change the category of race and ethnicity, supposedly to make it easier, but I think it's going to make things more complicated, and it will greatly impact the Latino population. So before it was Hispanic, right? And then non-Hispanic white, Black, Asian American, and Native American were the major categories. Well, now they're taking Hispanic out of that category, and they're going to ask just the race questions, and then they're going to drop in the different ethnicities. And they're like, now every ethnicity gets to say, where they're from and who they are. But the way things are federally funded are based on census race populations. So if you're Hispanic white, now you're in that white area, and guess what? Minority programs go out the window. So this is a major concern and a major issue for us. If any of you work with research companies or whatnot, I urge you to push back on the census. That's my own personal plight right now, trying to figure out, how do we show the detriment to the Latino community by reorganizing it that way. It is true that you'd be able to put, I think up to 6 or 8 different groups, but you're still not funded on ethnic groups, you're funded on race groups. And so that is a big issue. Next slide, please.
Do you know why are they doing that? Do they have like a response to something like why are they doing it?
Yeah. So much like the artificial growth that Paul showed you on multiracial, it's to be more exact in the counting of population. But by being more exact in ethnicity, you lose an entire category in race. That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's just not affecting Hispanics too. We're seeing other groups that it's impacted as well, like in Africa and Middle Eastern countries as well, where a lot of people, they don't know what to fill out because they don't feel like they identify with some of the groups that are listed. So
yeah, I mean, that's another imperfection, right? It's both North Africans and Middle Easterns, according to our census, are categorized as white. And they certainly wouldn't categorize them that way, but that's the only way they can. Eduardo, did you have a question?
Yes, Monica, I even wrote it down, pushback on census, right? Because I believe, but if it gets moved down for race, ethnicity, will the programs also be modified that, for example, if somebody wants to provide support to Latinos minority, but now it's only ethnicity, will the program still only look at race, or will they go to also account for ethnicity?
Yeah. So right now, federal programs look at race, and Hispanic is in that group. That's why they take it that way. So all of that funding, in essence, goes away. It would take, I think, an act of Congress literally to get federal programs to fund by ethnicity, because now you've got 1,000 ethnicities. I mean, so many different ones. How do you give more to one than the other? And what's considered together? Do we get everybody who was in former Yugoslavia and put them together, or do we give to Croatia and Slovenia? And, in that sort of way, it becomes very complicated. So in their effort to do that, it really changes the way the government will look at its populace. And frankly, it's going to look like we have far more equity than we do. We don't have that parity with other races. And so it will be very disjointed.
Thank you.
And it will impact all these numbers.
All of it.
it's going to be harder to compare it to.
Yeah, you can't compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges anymore unless you decide, like if Paul and I sat down and said, okay, we're going to take, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Venezuela, and we're going to group those together and count them as one. But that, again, is us doing it, and
So much more additional.
and how do you weight it for it?
And people are going to have to understand that.
Yeah, it's very hard to weight. So it's a really big issue. I know people are like, oh, you're just research geeks complaining about the census. It affects us all, believe me when I say that. So we wanted to talk a little bit about education. Arizona is interesting. So we are ranked 47th in the country in terms of educational achievement. We're just above Alabama. And so this is a problem for the business community because for two reasons. One, that's our future workforce and our future entrepreneurs. And I always kind of bring it home by saying, when you're old and in your nursing home, do you really want somebody who came out of our school system holding the hypodermic needle to give you your medication? We need a skilled workforce. Teachers are not the problem, by the way. The education problem that we have has nothing to do with education or educators. It has everything to do with the social determinants of a healthy community. Things like we're asking kids to study science and math when they don't have any food in their bellies, or they don't know they slept in the car last night, or they don't know if their parents are going to be home when they get there. I grew up in California. We used to have an earthquake plan. If we were separated during the earthquake, we knew where to meet. These families have deportation plans. If you get home and your parents aren't home, you need to know who to call, whose house to go to. That's a lot for a K through 12 student to carry while they're trying to study. Right now, we know that it's 46%. It's actually a little bit higher. Almost half of the students in our K through 12 public school system are Latino right now. We also know that of AF-rated schools, Latinos make up 67% of those F-rated schools, but only make up 27% of A-rated schools. This isn't even statistically possible unless there's some redlining and historical manipulation, if you will, to get students to certain schools. So if half of your population is Latino, how is it that only 27% are in A schools, but yet 67% are in F schools? And then everything in between, right? And so really looking at our education system, I told you the first problem. The second problem is that we have large companies that come to Arizona. And we used to be able to trade on, cheap housing and sunshine. Now, cheap housing, not so much. Sunshine, yes, definitely. But those big companies come to Arizona with employees who have families, who have kids that they want to send to good schools, right? And so it's really difficult to argue that we will lose another generation of students before we fix this problem, if we fix it at all. Arizona has the 6th largest Latino student population, and 86% of English learners are Latino, which makes sense given our geography. You go to other states and it's different. We also have a very large, and people don't realize this in Arizona, but we have a very large refugee population as well. And so that's what contributes to some of those numbers. Next slide, please. Yep.
So this is, I think, the last slide, but here's another really good report that I recommend you guys check out. Once the presentation is shared with you guys can just click on these hyperlinks and take you directly to the reports that we're citing. So this is the State of the Latino Entrepreneurship Report. It's based out of Stanford. So this is another really good one. I've mentioned the UCLA one. These are probably my top 2 favorite ones personally. But what they looked at was business growth over a decade from 2009 to 2019. And they looked at Hispanic businesses, how they were doing compared to non-Latino, non-Hispanic businesses. So what they found is that Latino businesses grew by 34% in that period. This is for the U.S. overall, a survey based on U.S. businesses. So Latino businesses grew at 34%. If we look at all businesses overall, everybody they surveyed, it only grew at a rate of 1%. And white businesses actually decreased by 6%. So what this demonstrates to me, this is like my framework of what we're doing good, where the opportunity is. This is what we're doing good. We're doing really good as a population of, growing our businesses in terms of establishing more businesses. But here's the area of opportunity on the right side. Latino-owned companies earn revenues on average of $1.2 million per year, as opposed to non-Latino firms that brought in about $2.3 million on average. So that's where the gap is. That's where the opportunity is. Like I said, we're really good at expanding, creating our businesses that way. But in terms of getting our revenue, we need to work on that to generate some parity there. So that's the area of opportunity.
I would just add that here locally, we see this playing out as well. When we did our minority business enterprise study in 2012, we found that while most small businesses as defined by the census were making about $500,000 in average annual revenue, Latino-owned businesses were only making $110,000 in average annual revenue. In our 2022 study, we updated that number. We gained a little over $100,000. We're at $240,000. That is still half of what non-Latino owned companies are making. And so in very simple math, that is a loss to the state of about $10 billion that could be put back into the state's economy. And so we work a lot with different businesses to help them scale, because what's going to happen is what I call the perfect storm. You're going to have a lot of businesses, because Latino-owned businesses are growing 3 to 4 times faster than non-minority-owned businesses. So they're going to be growing horizontally in units, but they're not going to be growing or scaling in average annual revenue. So you're going to have a lot of businesses making very little money, and that is not good for the economy. We want to be able to increase that. And so that's why we sort of do the work that we do. There was one other point on this that I wanted to make that is escaping me at the moment. I'm sure I'll think of it when I'm in the shower tomorrow. But all in all, again, I think it's important for us to understand and come from a place of data, particularly in Arizona, where politics are so polarizing. When we come with data and we speak from a place of evidence, it is far more effective, and taking the emotion out of it is far more effective, coming from, a place of fact. I mean, these are the numbers. I didn't make them up. These are numbers all from 100 different sources. Yes.
So is the reason that Hispanic businesses revenue is lower than for non-Latinos is the kind of businesses that are opening as a faster pace.
Yeah. That's certainly part of it. We see a lot of growth in professional services. So things like accountants, financial planners, consulting companies, those tend to be far greater in the Latino community. But they're also businesses that are very seasonal, and that, you've got to average that out through the whole year. If, tax season is January to April, you've got to make that work for you until December, right? And so I think it's twofold. One, yes, they're in industries, but two, they're also in industries that are seasonal. And so that plays a big role in it. And I just remembered the other part. As marketers, you're the only group that I share this with, but we have a presentation on culturally incorrect advertising, which is one of my favorites. And we always end this presentation with a little bit of humor and just say, some of you may remember when we used to just translate commercials, and it was horrible, right? All of these terrible mistakes. Now we talk about transcreation, making sure that your messages are culturally competent. But, we learned from Braniff Airlines, who inspired everyone to vuela en cuero, or fly naked. We also had Got Milk campaign that, asked women if they had milk. Tienes leche, right? Are they lactating? And so all of these, there's so many examples. I'm always a collector. When I go into antique stores, I look for those posters of print ads, and I have found quite a few of just like, this is bad. This is just really bad, right? Those usually in the 60s or 70s. In the 80s, you started to have the advent of multicultural agencies, of Hispanic agencies, but still had a strange dynamic because they were always a subset, or the redheaded or brown-skinned stepchild of the general market agencies. So we've seen a lot of that as well. But just a little food for thought there. Next slide. I think this is the end. Yeah. If you heard anything that you thought was interesting, that you want to repeat, please tag us on social media. Adrian is with us today, our senior manager of marketing. And, we appreciate all the likes and posts and tweets and all of that good stuff. And I think on the next slide, is there a contact on there? Yeah, that's the end of it. So thank you for your time and attention. We'll open it up for questions if you don't like. What method or medium can Latinos be reached most effectively? There's one thing. Latinos are early adopters to technology. In fact, when you couldn't get a hardline phone in Mexico, you always had a cell phone with you. So text campaigns are really becoming quite popular. They're harder to get, right? You have to kind of put out a carrot out there to get the numbers. But text campaigns can be very, very effective. Latinos are more likely to click on those links. They're more likely to read them. Very similar to direct mail. The reason is because in direct mail, Latinos get something like 3 times less direct mail than the general population. Same thing for text messages. So we're seeing this kind of rise that we're watching on text messaging and what that looks like, especially with smartphones now, that it can be a more dynamic experience. It's not just the text, but you can touch on a link and then it gives you some animation in a message, and you can personalize those, which is really nice too. Other questions?
We had a question in the chat here. Can you give us some more information on the messaging and themes that resonate most with the Latino audiences, and perhaps even what does not resonate at all? And it might also have to do with maybe those tiers that you were discussing earlier in the presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. I can give you 2 examples just from personal experience. The first is NFL. I think I've shared this with this group in previous years, but it is the story about me helping to stop World War III. And I was working with the NFL, and it was going to be the first NFL game off U.S. soil. It was going to be in Mexico City. It was between the 49ers and the Cardinals. And they wanted to do a tagline specifically for the Latino community and for the Spanish dominant in Mexico City. So they sent me all these. They sent me all of these taglines, and we're sitting in a meeting, and I've got all these ex-football players who are executives, right? And then me, who know, soccer is my game. I'm like football, whatever. I didn't even know who the players were. My other claim to fame is I asked Dan Marino what he did for a living, but I digress. I digress. And so I'm sitting there and they're like, what do you think of these taglines? And they were in Spanish. The least offensive was NFL el fútbol verdadero.
Real.
And I'm like, yes, the real football. Yeah. NFL, the real football. Well, and so they're like, what do you think? And I said, I think that if you want to start World War III, this is a really good way to do it. Because you're going to go to the Temple of Soccer, Azteca Stadium with 100,000 people, and you're going to tell them that NFL is the real football? Are you insane? To their credit, they listened. They went with a far more innocuous tagline, which was NFL Fútbol Americano. And
that's not... She agree with the Americano, like the whole...
Right. So you're welcome. Thank you. The other one is a very familiar credit card company. And you all will remember, I won't say which one it is, but they used to use the Viking invasions as their commercials, right? It was all about kind of like taking over and conquering and whatnot. And I remember being in the room with, other Hispanics, and we had done research groups and whatnot. And now they wanted to do Hispanic, and they're like, can we just translate this to Spanish? And I'm like, we're still a little sensitive about the whole colonization thing. So maybe you want to take it down a bit, because they wanted to show Vikings and Spaniards invading Mexico. And I thought, this is another good way to start a war. But so just a couple of examples there of kind of being tone deaf with regard to things that resonate. Language always resonates, right? Family resonates with this particular group. It really depends on the product or the service and what that is in order to understand what is the best way to connect. But what I do say, and I don't know if all of you have noticed this, but when I go to another country that speaks a different language, if I hear people speaking English, particularly American English, I'm like, oh, okay, that's nice. They're also from America. If I hear someone speaking Spanish, I'm like, oh, where are you from? Let's talk. Let's engage. That reaction is a visceral reaction that happens when things are in language, whether you're fully bilingual or not. Even if you're English dominant, there are words that are in your family that you will recall. The question of segmentation is really a tough one. There was a time probably in the 90s where it was very regionalized. So if you were doing anything in the Southwest, it was all Mexican. If you were doing anything in New York, it was Puerto Rican. If you're doing anything in Miami, it was Cuban. And by that, I mean mostly Cuban Spanish, Puerto Rican Spanish, and Mexican Spanish. So that has really, it wasn't terribly cost effective for companies to do that. So they went back to this kind of Walter Cronkite Spanish, so that's what I call it anyway, also known as Colombian Spanish for those of you from Colombia. And so those kinds of things resonate. And then to answer the other part of the question about what turns people off, it's pretty hard to turn Latinos off. Like, we're pretty easygoing as consumers, and we're willing to accept effort, right? We're willing to accept trying to speak the language. We're trying, we're pretty easy about those things. I think it's the generalizations that kill us, the stereotypes, right? The sombrero. I have to tell you, as of late, the whole idea of Hispanic Heritage Month and Black History Month and Women's Month, all of that, like, we're here all year long. Why do I only get calls between September 15th and October 15th? And I use the analogy of, like, we're not Elf on a Shelf. You can't just pull us out on September 15th, parade us around and then put us back. We're here all year long, and we're contributing all year long. So that was a very long answer to a very good question. I hope that was helpful.
Yes, thank you so much. At the moment, we don't have any other questions in the chat. Are there any questions in the? And they said, thank you so much. That must have fully answered their question. So thank you.
Oh, good. Good. Thank you. Oh, go ahead. What about different types of media, television, newspapers, social media, obviously? What's not most effective? Because we work at Hospital of the Valley in Villalobos, and we're still doing billboards, and Spanish language commercials, for television, for invitations, for telemoto. But it's still hard to reach, this audience.
Yeah, it is. And you have a very difficult topic. And by the way, thank you both. You all took care of my father. And
Can you please repeat the question for the virtual audience?
So sorry. It's Hospice of the Valley asking about radio, television, those, how do you reach Latino consumers more effectively? And so now I understand your question a little bit more, because that's hard to do on text. Like, hey, is someone dying in your family? Like, call us. That's a little awkward, right? So I think in that particular case, what I would recommend are more experiences, right? It's people that have utilized your services, that are happy, that have testimonials, whether that's on television or billboards or radio. There's still some data. It used to be much more separated, where it's like Latinos only listen to radio, and that's the best way to go. That's a generational question. Mm. So if you've got older generation, which may be your target, talking about companionship care and whatnot, I would probe and spend money in rather than having like a 60-second commercial or a 30-second commercial, doing talk shows. So things like, I know Once Noventa La Onda has a bunch of different talk show programs. And because what you're doing is culturally different than what we expect, which is take care of your family, right? You don't put your parents in a nursing home ever. I mean, no. You move them in with you. You live in a multi-generational household. You take care of them directly. You don't delegate that care to someone else. And so I think you need to get past that cultural barrier and have really honest conversations about that. Because I know my family struggled with that with my dad. Like, we're definitely not putting him in a nursing home. So that's not going to happen. But we're exhausted, right? We're watching him around the clock. And when we let Hospice of the Valley come in, it was just, even if it was like an hour, to breathe and just to be like, okay, that's okay. That you're not betraying your culture by doing that, right? So in that particular case, I think you've got some unique barriers.
Mark, I want to go back to the question, the comment you said about the 501c6 political committee. You mentioned about the bill that's already been passed with respects to E-Verify for subcontractors. And
that was taken out. In this version. Yeah. In this version, the contractors, independent contractors and subcontractors piece was taken out. All references to DACA were also removed, but what was left in there was E-Verify used for healthcare services, which is you show up in an emergency room, you've got an emergency, you have to E-Verify someone before you can give them any kind of care, which is ludicrous. There are a few other things in that as well. And that's the C4 political action committee.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
We have an additional question online. Okay. What about the difficult decisions related to healthcare, like advanced directives? And what is an effective way to message for those?
Yeah. Just like Hospice of the Valley here, I think you need to get past the cultural barriers. That's a much longer conversation than that 60-second radio commercial or the 30-second TV commercial or the billboard, right? You can only put so much copy on a billboard. So I would recommend doing more talk shows or shows where you can be an invited guest speaker to talk about, what it is to use real world experiences, to use testimonials. It's in the messaging. With regard to how you get that out, obviously, television is great, but it's costly. Radio is probably more cost effective. Social media, that's something you can really do on social media because you've got so many different platforms and you can reach so many more people.
Thank you for that.
Sure. Anybody else? Oh, sorry, Haley.
Just regarding the schools, for example, like my daughter, and Kyrie Dollars, I think the school language program.
Yeah.
I mean, is there any way to combat what's going on? Because, for example, in Scottsdale, some crazy little is doing the dual language program, where within research, there's 30.2% is white that attend the schools, and they have better math and reading proficiency than all the rest of the schools. So regarding pushing back on that and promoting the bilingual aspect, is there anything that you can suggest to do? Because I know the school that my daughter attends to is a little bit under.
Yeah. So write to Superintendent Warren, first and foremost. I can't promise that will be, that he'll listen to that, but I do believe that if he gets enough of that, at least it will be on his radar. The second thing is there is an organization, Unidos U.S., it's formerly NCLR, National Council of La Raza, and they're helping us with the campaign around repealing 208, which is the English-only law. Also, support Isaac School District, and they're basically going against the law right now and saying, forget it, we're going to do a dual language program. They're probably going to get sued. And so just supporting them in that lawsuit and making sure that they get it through. And to your point, you can go to Scottsdale and pay a whole lot of money for a dual language immersion school and nobody bats an eye at that, right? But you do it in our public schools and all of a sudden it's a crime. And so those are three things that I would recommend on the dual language, but keep pushing for it. We need as many voices in that fight as we can get.
Oh, I just like everywhere there's speak Spanish, so it only benefits my daughter, right, able to speak Spanish and English. It just makes sense.
Agreed.
So I'm sure most brands consider Hispanic marketing for it, right? Mm-hmm. But although I feel it's kind of like an afterthought, because when you see their budgets for Hispanic marketing, it's not there, right? And I don't know if you guys track this information on, what corporations, companies, and brands are spending on Hispanic marketing. But what can we do as marketers to convince our C-level, our executives, or even our clients to the importance? I know this is the stuff that we need to present to them, right? Price data. But any advice you can give us?
I mean, it's an age-old problem, unfortunately. When you and I started in the business, it was still a problem. It's that brown-skinned stepchild, as I mentioned earlier. And you know that because of the budgets. Right? Put your money where your mouth is. Whenever I went to an ad agency, I was like, how much are you spending on Latino? Is that proportional to the population? Because that's how much the budget should be. And it was usually like, oh, we have $500 million for our advertising budget and Latinos are getting $5 million. And it's like, yeah, but the population is 30% of your base, of your customer base. And so it was always an afterthought. I think there are a couple of things. One, there still aren't enough Latino or Hispanic or minority-owned ad agencies. They've started and then they're sold off to a general market. And then usually it becomes one person who's the multicultural specialist, right? And so I think there's that. The other thing is sharing data, as you mentioned, making sure that they have these numbers. And then the third thing I think is showing them what really successful programs look like. I like to point to Toyota. I think Toyota did a really good job integrating bilingualism, right? Showing multi-generational in a very affluent setting. And so making sure that they're not falling into those stereotypes, but showing them, this is what works. Those numbers are tracked. We can probably get them from Univision, but the spend is always tracked. And it still continues to be minuscule compared to general market firms. I was very proud of the Arizona Coyotes. When they were here, they really took an opposite approach and said, our growth base is Latino. We've got to be in that mix of soccer and baseball, and how do we do that? And so their budget was much more Latino oriented. Now, they had a Latino owner with a media company, and they had a Latino president, first ever in NHL history, but they're gone.
For that.
For now.
Right.
Yes.
Any other questions? Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. We will send this out along with the recording. So you have that in this presentation.
And the link to all the books. We'll get that to you too.
Okay. We'll send you all the stuff. So I want to thank all the academics for coming. There's a couple of things at AMA. Our year starts July 1st. So we have an upcoming calendar coming out soon. So please take a look at our website. If you want to get on our email list, there's a way to our website. You can do that, or you can email me. I will have my information from the email listing down as well. If you like to volunteer and be part of this wonderful organization, we have some board members with us now. Meredith Dennis is our incoming vice president-elect, starting July 1st, and Liza Buchanan is our VP of TPI. So we're excited to have Liza on board this year. And then Haley is one of our volunteers helping us with us programming. We also have one of our board members, Dave Yass, picked this to be a vice president with us as well. So if you'd like to get involved, please reach out to me or anybody on the board. Anything else, Taylor, we have on the slides? Our job board. If you are looking for staff, your department, your company, we do have a job board specific to marketing that is also connected to our national job board. So you will reach candidates across the country. And next slide. And if you want to know more about how to become a member of the AMA, you can find information on our website, but I'm happy to answer those questions too. So I want to thank you very much for coming, guys. I know this is important information to take back to your company to increase those budgets for the Latino markets. And if you have any questions, I'm going to be around here for another probably 30 minutes, but feel free. If you have the room till 5. Do we have the list of 5? Bob?
Yeah.
I think so. Yes. So feel free to stand around, talk to the Hispanic Chamber, or network among yourself. So thank you, guys.